Black Brawn, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Welcome to Card Table. My name's Jason. All right, today, Volume 8. Here's the original, One-Eyed Jacks, Volume 8. This is the original paperback edition from 1990, 91, let's say 91, I think. Gotta be 91, right? And then this is the Tor reissue, which has two new stories, one by Carrie Vaughn and one by Kevin Andrew Murphy, the same two authors who contributed a story each to the re-release of Volume 4. So a little bit of parallelism there. Also kind of unusual in that the Bantam paperback edition and the new Tor edition are actually depicting the same moment from the book, or approximately the same moment, certainly the same story, same lead character, the Oddity. I think this is the first time that the Tor edition does that, where it actually just kind of takes the same moment as the Bantam edition did. Although it won't be the last time, because I think Volume 11 does the same. Lots of trivia in the old noggin about these books. I don't know how interesting it is, but that's why we're doing these videos, because just in case it is interesting. So that's the Oddity fighting a bunch of young punks with Ellis Island kind of in the background there, or the implication of the sort of what's the implication of the Ellis Island, I guess you could say, which is an important feature of this whole sequence of books. And then there's the Oddity again. I don't want to hate on Tim Truman, who does these Bantam edition covers, because I do think they have a kind of a pulpy quality that's enjoyable. But I think any Wildcards fan who is familiar with the books, read them more than once, or even only has to have read them once, knows that the Tim Truman covers are sort of an abbreviated, simplified version, I guess, of what you actually kind of see in your mind's eye, based on what is actually rendered in the prose itself. So this version of Oddity is recognizable as the Oddity, but a little comic bookified, a little simplified. This version, even though you can't see his face in this version, this is still definitely, I think, conveys more of what the creator of the character, Stephen Lee, had in mind for Ye Oddity, Ye Old Oddity. I guess we can ignore this little circle, because I'm not sure that's still relevant, but then again, maybe it is. But anyway, great Michael Comark cover. I love this rendition of the Oddity. Really, I think gets across the what's the right word? Sort of the physical, just the intimidating physical scope of him. That he's sort of 3-in-1, with this sort of triple strength, kind of triple sized figure roaming Jokertown. This very intimidating figure, all kind of swathed in his robes and in his fencing mask. Great cover. Even really, Michael Comark's covers are so great, because even all the little details in the background are great. Like, I really love this whole sort of graffiti. That down. This whole graffiti-ish, graffitified wall behind him looks really cool. So great edition. Of course, there's new stories in this, so obviously this is the edition that you want. Although if you can find this one cheap, go ahead and pick it up too. My personal history with the series is that my friend John, who I can't thank enough in these videos, whether he watches them or not, I don't know, but got to give all possible credit to him for being obsessed with them first, and then I sort of backstered his obsession and stole it and made it part of my own personality. As we often do when we're teenagers. We sort of glom onto others, or at least some of us did, who didn't have enough of a sense of identity of our own. So thank you, John, for doing this to me. But he discovered the books by receiving Volume 7 as a gift, as I understand it. I believe that's the story that I remember him telling me back then, when we were 13 or 12 or whatever it was. And loved it a lot, loved the whole noir element. I talked about it last time when I talked a little bit about 6 and 7, and how 7 is the sort of brilliant, quintessential private eye kind of story, private eye noir kind of story filtered through the prism of the mutated Wildcards universe. Created a love in John and probably in me too of anytime the detective genre is mashed up with something else. In the case of Wildcards, it's the whole kind of superhero mutant world. But John was also a big fan of Blade Runner, which kind of mashed it up with the sort of sci-fi cyberpunk genre, and Cast a Deadly Spell. I already said this last time, I know, but Cast a Deadly Spell, a made-for-TV movie where, what's that actor's name? I want to say Fred Ward. I suppose I could look it up, but I won't. Leave that for the comments. Fred Ward playing a private eye in a world where magic exists, so it's kind of a mashup of the sort of fantasy genre with the private eye tropes. And John was a big fan of that movie, and so was Carrie Vaughn. So I speculated last time that maybe she, as a young Wildcards fangirl herself, maybe also her love of that movie was inspired by having read Volume 7 of Wildcards. That's a pretty big logic leap, I know. So if Carrie Vaughn is watching, I apologize if I'm making huge leaps and bounds in terms of what I'm assuming about how your tastes developed. But just basing it on some personal experience, so no offense intended. So the upshot of that is that after reading Volume 7 and loving Volume 7, he went back and bought the first 6 books and the comics that were coming out at around that time, and he, of course, shared all that stuff with me. He had already bought Volume 1, so I read Volume 1 first and then skipped to Volume 7, which is an unusual way of doing it. I don't necessarily recommend that, but then again, I guess I shouldn't recommend against it because it worked on me and made me a lifetime fan. But it makes the most sense to read them in order. But as I mentioned at the end of the last video, I think the first 7 volumes do actually feel like a complete set or a complete season. The first 3 books are sort of considered the Astronomer Triad, and then 4, 5, 6, and 7 are considered the Puppet Man Quartet. At least if you look in the way they've started to arrange them in these Tor paperbacks. So we've got how's that? The original. They call it the original Triad. And then the Puppet Man Quartet is the second. So the first 7 books do comprise 2 arcs, and in a way, one grand arc in a way, because Volume 7 does, or really the whole Puppet Man Triad pays off a lot of things that are set up in the first book. I mean, Puppet Man first appears in the first book. That's the only example I can think of right now. There are other elements, though, that pay off in 6 and 7. Oh, like Golden Boy and his whole arc that ends in Volume 6 really starts in the first book. So that would be another example. And there's some other stuff involving the Golden Boy milieu, the 4 Aces, Tachyon and the 4 Aces and Blythe and all that. That sort of comes full circle in Volume 6. Chrysalis, who is killed in Volume 7, she first appears in Volume 1. So the first 7 volumes do feel like they're of a piece. They've always felt to me as like this is the original run. And of course, the other reason for that is because those were the 7 that existed when I first was exposed to Wildcards by John. That was the literature that existed. It was those 7 volumes. So there was something to me very strange about this one. Not strange in a bad way, but just it was like, oh wow, I can actually get in on the ground floor of this new arc. They say in the back. How do they write it? They say, begin a 3-book struggle against the greatest enemy the Wildcards have ever faced. I don't know, these things in the back are a little bit bogus. The way they sometimes the way they write this stuff is reads a little odd to me. I don't know who writes these things on the back. I apologize if it's actually one of the authors. But anyway, it introduces the jumpers. And they say in the back it's just the start of a new 3-book cycle. So they say very specifically it's the start of something new. And it does read that way too, I think. It always has. But again, I suspect part of that is because it does actually continue threads that were from the earlier books. It's not like a complete break where it's like, oh, everything from the first 7 books is now done and resolved. And now we're starting brand new story arcs with Volume 8. Even though it sometimes feels that way in my head, when I actually sit down and read it, and any other fans would know what I mean. There's still some of the typhoid choroid exposures where certain people are exposed to the mutated wildcard virus from Volume 5, and then we never found out how that mutation manifested. We just know that they're at the moment latent. So Veronica, who very clearly gets infected, it's very obvious that she has been infected by typhoid choroid in Volume 5, and then we're never really, and then she kind of disappears. She's not really in 6 or 7. Same with St. John Latham, one of the villains, the lawyer associated with the Shadow Fists. One of the great villains in Wildcards. I don't know that I've talked about him much. There's so many characters. It's hard to really talk about every single person from every single book. But St. John Latham, a great villain from the first 2 books, particularly Volume 3 and Volume 5. He plays a very significant role. Again, I don't think he's around at all in 6 and 7. So 2 very prominent characters, Veronica and St. John Latham, aka Loophole, both of whom are very clearly exposed to typhoid choroid, and then we just sort of don't check in with them for a while, and then it's in this book that we learn the nature of both of those characters' mutations. So that's one example. Also, this is the book where Mark Meadows, aka Captain Trips, comes back. He is hugely prominent in the first 2. Well, he's one of the main lead characters in a story in the first book. He plays a pretty darn significant role in the second book. We get to learn a lot about him. He's clearly a main character. And then he's pretty much sidelined in Volume 3. He's there, but doesn't do much. Is really just in a supporting role in Volume 5, and then he's another guy who just isn't around in 6 and 7. And then here, only now, in Volume 8, do we really continue the sort of saga of Captain Trips that started in the first 2 books. So there's another example where clearly this is not just some clean break from the first 7. So but I still think of it that way. It's an illusion, but it's there. I'm trying to think of some other examples. Examples of where supporting characters from earlier books can become lead characters in later books. Some really quintessential examples of that in this one. The Oddity, who first showed up in Volume 5, plays a pretty darn prominent role in 7, and then he's even on the cover. But they, I should say, that's their preferred pronoun. They, the Oddity, they are a lead character in Volume 8. And so Volume 7 is kind of clearly setting that up by giving the Oddity a lot of screen time, quote unquote, before having them show up as a lead here. Lazy Dragon is another one. Same exact trajectory, really. First showed up in Volume 5 as a supporting character, plays a very substantial role, but still supporting role in Volume 7, all of which is sort of set up for them finally becoming a lead character in Volume 8. How does it actually break down? We've got the interstitial by Walton Simons this time, writing the character of Jeremiah Strauss, who first appeared technically in the very first book in a very, very small role, and then actually has kind of been around. Is it a spoiler? I guess at this point we have to just assume that maybe I won't be too spoilery about Volume 8, but I guess at this point I can be spoilery about 1 through 7. Is that the rule? I don't know what the rules are for these YouTube series and / podcast things about books. I don't know how we're supposed to do it, but I guess I'll just assume that anyone watching this has read the first 7 books, and probably has read this one too. But so we know. So if you're watching this, Jeremiah Strauss was the great ape who I don't have my Volume 2 editions in here anymore, but he was the great ape, the King Kong clone essentially, who shows up on the cover of several editions of Volume 2, climbing the Empire State Building just like King Kong. So that was Jeremiah Strauss. He was the projectionist. This very just kind of has the equivalent of a walk-on part in the George R.R. Martin story in Volume 1, I believe. I think that's the one where he's the sort of shape changer who at the time doesn't seem to have any aspirations beyond just being an impressionist, because he's able to make himself look like all these classical Hollywood character actors, but he can't actually do impressions, so he sort of makes himself look like Humphrey Bogart and then fails utterly at doing a Bogart impression. Good gag. It seems like just a one-off gag, and then there's this King Kong impersonator in the second book, and it turns out that is the projectionist who. I don't think we actually are ever told why he became King Kong. It sounds like maybe he just thought he'd try it just to see if he could. Unless I'm forgetting, I don't think we ever actually get the story of why he ever decided to become, or if it was a conscious choice, or maybe he dreamed that he was King Kong and that caused his wildcard power to activate. As far as I know, we're never actually told why it happened, just that it did happen in 1965. And the part of the gag is that the great New York City blackout of 1965, which was not caused by a giant ape in the real world, but in the Wild Cards universe, they had the 1965 blackout, and in that case, it was actually because to become a giant ape, you have to take on a bunch of extra mass. And the best way to do that is to convert energy to mass. And so he just took all the energy out of New York City's electric grid, I guess, and or power grid, and became the giant ape. And I believe the idea is that either it's a function of his wildcard power, that if he becomes an animal, he'll start thinking like an animal, or maybe the idea is that that much mass powered by what's still a human relatively tiny brain can't quite control it, but he loses control, and he sort of, I think the implication is that he's got the ending of King Kong sort of replaying on a loop in his head, so all he can ever think to do is grab a blonde actress, or a blonde lady who I guess he hopes is an actress, and then climb to the top of the Empire State Building, at which point various New York City-based aces use their powers to bring him down, and then they imprison him in the Central Park Zoo, and then he escapes and does it again. And then in Volume 4, he's he's finally cured. Tachyon reaches into his mind and finds the consciousness of Jeremiah Strauss and causes him to change back to human in Volume 4. And then there's a bit of a retcon kind of dealio, where in Volume 5 he shows up during the Modular Man story and says, hey, I used to be the giant ape, and before that I was the projectionist, and he does some shapeshifting in a story set in 1987. And then in this book, which begins in fall of 88, over a year later, there's a bit about how his powers are just starting to come back, the idea that he had sort of a mental block after going from ape back to human form. There was a mental block that he couldn't access his powers, and then they're just starting to come back when this book starts. He tells that to Dr. Tachyon. He doesn't really have any reason to lie, as far as I can tell, because he does lie to other people that no, my powers are gone, they burnt themselves out, I can't do it anymore. Whereas he's honest with Tachyon and says, oh no, they've started to come back. But just started to, whereas a year ago in that Modular Man story, he was using them just fine. My headcanon is that he was very drunk in the Modular Man story, so drunk that he doesn't remember what happened that night, but he was just using his powers. The mental block was gone because he was so drunk. But then he woke up the next day and didn't remember doing it, and still thinks that he has lost his shape-changing power. Totally headcanon. I got no justification for that one, but kind of makes sense, right? So he's the star of this one. He'll eventually take on the moniker of Nobody, or Mr. Nobody, which is a great name for a superhero, I think, or for a superpowered character. And so Walton Simons does a fun thing where each of the interstitial bits, instead of being called just like Mr. Nobody Part 1, Mr. Nobody Part 2, which is often what they do, each section has a different title, and there's always like sort of a pun on some idiom involving the word nobody. So Nobody's Girl is one of them. Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen is another one. You're nobody till somebody loves you. Nobody's home, etc. So fun little conceit, I think. Fun little conceit's the right word, right? Fun conceit. And so what else? I guess I should use the well. No, we'll go with the orange volume first. Since this is the Man in Orange YouTube channel, technically, I guess. Originally, the stories were "Luck Be a Lady" by Chris Claremont, which introduces Claremont's character Cody Havero, who who presents as a gnat, I guess you would say, but is secretly an ace. I think the implication is that even she doesn't know she's an ace. Not sure how that would work, but it's never really been looked into too deeply. Then we have Horses by Louis Scheiner, which is about Scheiner's character Veronica, who is one of the prostitutes, one of the geishas working for Fortunato. Scheiner's character Fortunato essentially has his main arc play out in the first 4 books. In a lot of cases with these wild cards books, it depends on the author, but in some cases you'll find like an author basically pretty much always writing about the same character until that character's arc is done, and then they move on to someone else. That's more or less true of like John Joseph Miller, where he sort of writes Yeoman for the first 9 books, and then after book 9, Yeoman's story is basically done. So Miller's new POV character becomes Carnifex. Kind of true of Snodgrass, where she's always pretty much writing about Dr. Tachyon. And then when his arc finishes in volume 10, she switches to Dr. Bradley Finn, as her sort of next POV character. Like, I guess Simons would count in that too, where Walton Simons writes about Demise until volume 6, which is sort of the final chapter for Demise, and then his new POV character becomes Mr. Nobody for a while. So you'll see a couple examples of that. It's a fun thing to sort of track. But Louis Scheiner is another example where he's doing Fortunato for the first 4 books, and then is just kind of absent for a few books until he comes back, and Veronica is his new POV character. Veronica has no ace code name that I can recall, and also no surname. I went into the GURPS, or the old RPG guidebooks, and the more recent ones, just to make sure. I was like, did I miss Veronica's last name? It must have been mentioned somewhere, but it never is. She's just Veronica, for what that's worth. Then we get Snow Dragon by William F. Wu. Wu, like Claremont, this is the first time either of those 2 authors have contributed prose to a Wild Cards book. For Claremont, it's his first and last time. William F. Wu will show up a few more times. In this book, Wu is writing Lazy Dragon. Nowadays, Clancy can't even sing. Vic Milan returning to Captain Trips, which makes me very happy. 16 Candles is The Oddity by Stephen Lee. The Devil's Triangle, Tachyon story by Melinda Snodgrass. Dead Heart Beating by John Joseph Miller. Putting the lie to what I said before, where he always writes about Yeoman. His POV character in this story is a character named Fade Out. But it's basically part of the Yeoman saga. I've always thought of it that way, because Fade Out is essentially, he's a member of the Shadow Fists, which is the organization that Yeoman's trying to bring down, and so I sort of consider any member of the Shadow Fists as sort of like part of Yeoman's rogues gallery, and so in that sense, it really is just kind of forwarding the Yeoman story, even though Yeoman himself isn't in it. I feel like if you were to just read only the Yeoman stories to get that full arc, it would feel a little incomplete if you didn't also read the Fade Out story in this one. So that's what you had originally, and then the new version brings you 2 new stories, new additions. One of those, they both show up pretty early from what I recall. The Tower of Gold and Amber is now the second story, not counting the interstitials. It's the second story right after Claremont's. Kevin Andrew Murphy writes The Tower of Gold and Amber about a character named Trudy Pirandello. This is where I don't know, my obsessive compulsive loyalty to chronology makes it hard for me to describe exactly what's going on with a character like Trudy Pirandello, because her first appearance really is volume 21, which is titled Fort Freak. But this is volume 8, which is 13 before 21, a whole 13 books earlier, but this edition was published after, and it's sort of the very definition of retroactive continuity, I guess, where he retcons Trudy Pirandello into earlier in the books, which works really well because Pirandello is, aka Magpie. When she first appears in Fort Freak, she's, I want to say she's already an octogenarian. So it makes perfect sense to retroactively throw her back into earlier books like this. Makes perfect sense. But yeah, how do you talk about it now? Where it's like, well, her first appearance, if you're reading them in order, this book is now the first appearance of Magpie, but it's not. And then Carrie Vaughn writes A Broken Thread in a Dark Room, which I love so much. It's about Lady Black, which is the same POV character that Carrie Vaughn wrote about for Volume 4. And I talked about it at the time, that Lady Black is one of the characters on the world tour who is one of a couple where you go, why is it even mentioned that she's in there? Like, why even bring her up? Because she doesn't do anything. So it's really cool that Carrie Vaughn gave her something to do in Volume 4. Off the top of my head, I actually can't think of who created Lady Black. Joanne Jefferson is the character's civilian name. I'm not going to think of it off the top of my head. I mean, obviously it would be easy enough to check, but I mean, it doesn't matter for the present moment. But for what Martin, I think in one of his blogs talked about, because so Vaughn writes about Lady Black for Volume 4, and then again in this story in Volume 8, and then in Volume 9, the new version of Volume 9, there's a third Lady Black story. And I seem to recall Martin in a blog saying something like that the Volume 9 concludes the Lady Black trilogy, which maybe creates some odd expectations, or at least it did for me, because they're not, I don't really think of them, now having read them all, it's like, I don't know that they're really a trilogy. They're just 3 stories about the same character, but they don't quite comprise like a one full arc. It sort of feels like just 3 adventures of Lady Black, with the third one not necessarily being a resolution. It's just another story about her. If anything, I feel like there could definitely be more Lady Black stories in future books. I feel like her story isn't done yet. I certainly would still be up for some more Lady Black stories. That said, the one in Volume 8, A Broken Thread in a Dark Room, definitely my favorite of the 3 Lady Black stories that Vaughn does, and also possibly my favorite story as far as like all the newly interpolated stories. I think if we were to count them all up, it would be about 12 stories. It's like 3 in the first book, 3 in Volume 16, and then 2 more in 3 other books. So yeah, that would be 12. I never really thought about like, oh, do I have a favorite of those 12? But thinking about Broken Thread in a Dark Room, I think it might be my number 1 favorite. I also really like Powers by David Levine from Volume 1, and Ghost Girl Takes Manhattan, which is the Carrie Vaughn story about Jennifer Malloy in Volume 1. Those would be contenders as well. But probably it's between Powers and then Broken Thread in a Dark Room, because those 2 are both just really fabulous. But yeah, this one, well, I guess I'll get to it. Eh? So that's your overview as far as what to look at. Some other things maybe worth mentioning. For me, just anecdotally, in 1991, I had decided that I loved Chris Claremont. I was a big X-Men fan. Had really only been a fan of the X-Men comics for about 3 years at that point, which turned out to be Chris Claremont's last 3 years, 88, 4 years, I guess, 88, 89, 90, 91 were sort of Claremont's last 4 years on the X-Men. And somewhere in that span, I had realized, oh, this guy is what makes the X-Men great. Like, he's the guy. And then very tragically soon after I realized that he was what I really loved about the X-Men, yeah, he was gone. So that was a little sad. And I can't remember if this book came out, because I remember going to a bookstore and seeing this and thinking, oh my God. I think I thought, oh my God, I spotted it before John, because John hadn't told me about it. And I think it might have been a weekend, and then when I came to school that Monday, John had already bought this and was like, hey, new Wild Cards book. So I don't think I ever scooped John on Wild Cards news back then, but I thought I had for a few brief moments when I first saw this. But I remember paging through it. I don't think I had the cash to buy it at the time. I was only 13, so what are you going to do? But I remember paging through it and seeing Chris Claremont's name and thinking, oh my gosh, worlds colliding. Two of my favorite fictional universes, Wild Cards and X-Men. Worlds are coming together, having a little crossover, because there's Claremont in a Wild Cards book. So I was hugely excited about that. Didn't learn until much later that Claremont created the whole concept of this book, which is the jumpers. So the jumpers are, so this is the start of, like it says on the back, a 3-book struggle, except really it's 4 books. Although in that list, they do it weird in this list. If you look at this whole thing, I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. How do they put it? They call it the Rocks Triad, and then they list only 3 books. But this is book 8 and 9 and 11, and then they say solo novels, and then they put 10 down here, Double Solitaire. But really, Double Solitaire is part of that cycle. You could read them out of order, I suppose. You could go 8, 9, 11, and 10. There every so often there's a pair of books where they kind of take place simultaneously, like 6 and 7. So it's like, oh yeah, you could read them out of order, but I don't see how you could possibly say that Double Solitaire is not part of the Rocks saga. Because, I mean, book 9 literally ends on a cliffhanger that is resolved in book 10. That said, the suggestion of the way they sort of list the books out of order that way, and almost suggesting that you should read Dealer's Choice first and then Double Solitaire, 11 and then 10. I can get behind that. I could see why you might do that. Might actually be better, because there'd be certain spoilers that you'd avoid. You might be a little more surprised by certain developments in number 11, maybe. The point is really that it's 8, 9, 10, and 11 really are the Jumper saga. Even though they say it's only going to take 3 books to finish it, it takes 4. And I remember, I feel like other fans probably agree with me, if you were reading these in real time, it felt a little protracted. I think now that if you have all the books to read and you can just go, oh, as soon as I finish 8, move on to 9. As soon as I finish that one, move on to the next, and burn through all 4 of them in a short amount of time. I actually think it's a pretty good saga. I think it holds together pretty well, and it is enjoyable. Although like many fans, there's a certain sequence that I think we all have some reservations about, but we can get to that later. That's for a later book. So the Jumpers are these characters who they're sort of they're an enigma at first, because it's a bunch of teenagers who all have the same wildcard power, which is the ability to jump into another body, jump their mind or their personality into another body, and essentially switch places with them, so that whoever gets jumped, their mind is in the original jumper body, and usually can't handle it because they weren't expecting it, so they kind of fall unconscious. Meanwhile, the jumper can sort of do whatever they want while occupying a body that isn't theirs. Turns out that concept was also created by Chris Claremont, which is not something that really is credited anywhere. Like, nowhere in the Jumper saga do you actually see them say, I don't think, unless I just missed it, but I don't think they ever say, like, the Jumpers were created by Chris Claremont, or the Jumper concept was created by Chris Claremont. But it was. And I know Claremont never came back to do another story after he did this first one. And oddly enough, his story, which introduces Cody Havero, has no jumpers in it. So that's one of those unusual things where the concept you come up for wild cards, you might not be the first person to write about that concept or that character. In this case, Claremont wrote not a single page of actual jumper material, even in this first Jumper book. There aren't any jumpers in the Claremont story. All right, so on that note, I guess we can go through a little bit on each story. So Jeremiah Strauss, a.k.a. Mr. Nobody. So his story, it's sort of an interesting structure to his, because since it's the interstitial, he's a constant presence, and he's sort of the guy who's the interstitial always has kind of a dual purpose, where it's not only telling the story of a particular character, it's also sort of wrangling the other stories into a kind of coherent world and sort of helping to contextualize them against each other. Because almost every story involves the jumpers, there already is an overarching thing that binds them all together. So the interstitial, at least doesn't feel on the surface, to me as a reader, doesn't feel like it's doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of that element of it, which means it really can be more just about following the character of Jeremiah Strauss. And the book is set over about a year. It sort of starts in the fall of '88 or August of '88, which is just after the previous book ended. It takes you all the way to around summer of the following year, of '89. I'm big into the chronology, so I always have to mention exactly when the book takes place. But so we follow this sort of saga of Jeremiah Strauss over a whole year. There's kind of an interesting premise with Mr. Nobody, where he's got kind of a not quite a Mary Sue, but there's a definitely wish fulfillment element to his character, which I guess is true of a lot of the Wild Cards characters in a way, where if you just look at their power set and their deal, they seem like, oh, very enviable. Like even someone like the Turtle, I mean, the most powerful telekinetic in the whole universe of Wild Cards, flying around in this huge, battleship, basically, just getting to be a badass all over New York, badass superhero protected within your shell. And then once you get inside the character's head is when you realize that he's not so enviable, because he's got all these sort of psychological hang-ups. So in that sense, Mr. Nobody is kind of cut from a similar mold, where he's inherited wealth, so he never has to work, because he's part of this incredibly wealthy family. And then he's got this, really badass superpower where he can look like anybody. And I can't remember which, it's not in this very first book, but somewhere in a Mr. Nobody story, Simons kind of says, there aren't too many doors that are locked to you if you have a lot of money and can look like literally anybody. So, I mean, how enviable is that? And, but he's got, like anyone, he's got sort of the same sort of existential angst that you'll see in a lot of Wild Cards characters. In his case, it's sort of, not that it's ever spelled out quite this explicitly, but it's part of the idea is that he feels like he hasn't earned any of this stuff. He hasn't earned this wealth. It's just luck of the draw that he has this cool superpower. So he doesn't really feel like he as a person is really all that worthwhile. Has a real sort of self-loathing kind of quality to him. Despite the fact that the world is basically his oyster, he just kind of never feels like he actually, the inner Jeremiah Strauss is a person worth knowing. That kind of all he is his wealth and his powers, and that he doesn't really have anything to offer beyond that, beyond these things that were outside of his control, which is kind of cool. It does make for kind of a whiny character. It's one of those characters, and this is probably true of the Turtle as well, where it's kind of like there's a little bit of that, check your privilege reaction. At least when you read him in a more modern setting, he's sort of like, you got the world on a platter here, buddy. Like, maybe stop whining. I think he's still a fun character to read about. And one of the things that I always thought was kind of interesting is that really the story doesn't really end here. One of the reasons, and it's one of the reasons I suppose that when I first read Volume 8, I didn't like it that much, because really the climactic payoff to the Mr. Nobody stuff is actually in Volume 9, which is called Nobody. I want to say Nobody Gets Out Alive, but I think that's actually one of these. Yeah, that's the last one. I can't think of it. But there's one last Nobody story, not one last ever, but the last Mr. Nobody story to be a part of this whole Jumper saga actually is a story in Volume 9 by Walton Simons. And that's actually the one that really kind of pays everything off from this book. So it's kind of left hanging at the end of Volume 8. And so are a lot of the stories in this one. And I do remember it being frustrating when you got to the end of it. It was kind of like, boy, every single thing is kind of a cliffhanger, sort of, just wait till you read the next one. There's going to be a lot of stuff going down, because you're kind of like, well, what about in this one? I wanted to see some stuff go down. Again, it's one of those things that when they were coming out in real time was a little frustrating about this arc. These days, when you can finish 8 and go right into 9, not really a problem. But I will say that is sort of a feature of the Nobody saga in this book, is that when you get to the end of it, it's like, oh, you didn't really conquer any demons. But then in Volume 9, he kind of comes back, and it's very satisfying. It's like, all right, like all the kind of whining that we had to endure during this one, he's finally starting to turn it around. Something to be aware of if you finish Volume 8 and you're thinking, boy, what a sad sack this Jerry Strauss is. Just wait till Volume 9. It's going to pay off great. And then from there, okay, so that's the interstitial. So then Luck Be a Lady by Chris Claremont. So this is another thing where it never really hit me until really it was when chatting with John Joseph Miller online that I got it. And then when you go back and read it, you get it. But the idea that Cody Havero, who identifies as a gnat, is actually an ace but doesn't realize it, with her power being kind of a luck thing, makes me think of Longshot from the X-Men. She's not a character that Claremont created, but that story is called Luck Be a Lady, and so the idea is that Cody has this. Well, it's never explicitly said, so. Like I say, I didn't really, until John Joseph Miller mentioned it during kind of some online interaction, I was like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about, John? What are you talking about? She's not an ace. When did they say she's an ace? And they never do. But there's just this, every so often they make mention of how her luck was, they say it without saying it. They sort of say, how could anyone be that lucky? Or like, what are the odds? You know, those kind of like little phraseologies come up with a lot of things that happen to Cody. So there you go. I guess I spoiled it, but not really, because to spoil it, something would have to actually be revealed in the books, and Cody's luck powers is never revealed in the books. So I couldn't possibly have spoiled anything just now, can I have? But she's a doctor who ends up working at the Jokertown Clinic, becomes a female romantic foil for Dr. Tachyon. Always thought they were kind of a cool pair. Claremont is sort of known for, or amongst comic book fans, is kind of known for the what they call the Claremont female, who's sort of the criticism has been that they seem so masculine. They don't really seem like. They seem like just masculine traits sort of artificially layered onto a female persona or female personality, which I would take issue with that. I don't like what's implied by that kind of line of logic. But in a general sense, if you think in terms of like stereotypically masculine qualities, a lot of Claremont's females have those qualities. I guess that's you can certainly make that case pretty easily. Anyway, so I thought it occurred to me that Melinda Snodgrass's characters, at least in Wildcards, not all of them, but a couple of them do have a kind of, they're male characters who have kind of a feminine energy in some ways, or an effeminate sort of quality to them. Tachyon, I think, definitely qualifies. There's a wonderful sequence in the first book where he kind of bursts out crying during his testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and there's a great moment of self-awareness where he kind of thinks to himself, "Oh, I've just broken another of their taboos. Like men on Earth aren't supposed to cry," and it's sort of a great, really, just that little thought. The fact that he has that thought in his head is a great little kind of turnaround of the sort of cliche of a man who cries, like what a what a girl, that cliche, which again, I don't like those kind of cliches. So it's a great lampshading of that, where he doesn't act the way a man is supposed to because he was raised in an alien culture, but he knows it. He's not oblivious. He's aware of the reaction of the men on Earth when he does something like burst into tears, or dress very flamboyantly, or there's just from the description you picture a guy who is very flamboyant in his gestures and his manner of speaking. And then another Snodgrass character like that is from the more recent, the post-Tor relaunch era. Noel Matthews is the British secret agent who's deadly, like one of the most deadly secret agents who ever worked for the British government, for Her Majesty's Secret Service, but has a very again, kind of flamboyant energy in his interactions. Has got a certain effeminate energy to him, which again I say without judgment and with all the acknowledgement of what does that mean anymore to say, oh, these qualities are feminine and these are masculine. I certainly agree with anyone who says that those are very artificial constructs. But my point being, though, is that to put a Claremontian female together with a Snodgrassian male creates a very interesting and cool dynamic, very fun to read about dynamic, where you've got Cody being the more hard-edged of the two, and Tachyon being the softer of the two in the couple, even though they're both very much heterosexual and heteronormative, but they still bring. There's a certain swapping of energies, if you think in terms of masculine versus feminine qualities, again in the conventional sense of those and stereotypical sense of those terms. So what Tachyon brings versus what Cody brings to the table when as their sort of romantic dance kind of goes, it really works. So I think in a way it's a pretty brilliant development to give Tachyon a Claremont female as his main romantic foil. Very good choice. I'm not a huge. Well, I guess I mentioned I didn't want to get too negative. I will say that considering the fact that I love Chris Claremont so very much, I don't think his wildcard story is his best work. When I compare it to like First Flight and Grounded, which are the Claremont's prose novels, sci-fi novels that he wrote around pretty close to around the same time as Luck Be a Lady, or the George Lucas Willow sequels that he did. The Shadow War. It's like Shadow Moon and Shadow Star, Shadow something else. The Shadow Trilogy. If you look at just the prose in those books, some of it's really, really beautiful stuff. First Flight and Grounded are both really great sci-fi novels, in my opinion. Luck Be a Lady is good, but it isn't my favorite when you're talking Claremont prose. Which was a bummer for me, because I was kind of thinking, like I said, worlds colliding, Wildcards and X-Men. This is going to be the best Wildcard story ever. So I guess I probably held it up to expectations that it was never going to meet, unfortunately. Tower of Gold and Amber, which is one of the interpolated stories. It's another example of kind of retconning a little bit, because in the later books there's a sort of Donald Trump substitute, or Donald Trump doesn't. I mentioned it before. It's kind of like how Jim Morrison doesn't exist in the Wildcards universe, but he kind of does. It's just that they call him Tom Marion Douglas instead. So Donald Trump is a little bit like that too in the Wildcards universe, where instead there's a character named Duncan Towers who becomes vice president of the United States in Wildcards reality rather than president. At the appropriate time, 2016 or I think it's 2012 in the Wild Cards universe that he becomes vice president, I believe. So just like Donald Trump was already around in 1988, of course, that means Duncan Towers was as well. So Kevin Andrew Murphy sort of retcons him into 1988, the Wild Cards timeline, with the Tower of Gold and Amber. It's a pretty goofy one. It's pretty farcical. It just involves Trudy Pirandello, who's a teleporter and a thief. So Trudy Magpie Pirandello robs Duncan Towers with the help of Croyd Crenson, the sleeper, and Jessica Van der Staat, who is a character that does not appear in Volume 7, but is mentioned in Volume 7 as a little girl who can shrink people down to a tiny size. She's an important plot device in Volume 7, although she never actually appears on screen. Though there is a character in Volume 21 named Jessica Penniman, who has the exact same power, and age-wise, she almost has to be Jessica Van der Staat, and just either has changed her name because of marriage or maybe another reason. I feel like there's a story there because she's from this kind of wealthy, she's an heiress essentially. She's from a very wealthy family, so the natural assumption would be that eventually she inherits a bunch of money from her parents. But instead, she's a blue collar. She's working just as a cop in Fort Freak in Volume 21. Last name isn't Van der Staat anymore. So there seems to be a story there. I'd love to see that get explored at some point. We get maybe a little clue as to what is going to happen in this one, where there's a lot of stories in Wild Cards where a child of wealthy parents is rejected because of the fact that they're a wild card. Although that hasn't happened to Jessica yet. So maybe in this case, Jessica is the one who rejects her parents. Don't know. She's still a little kid in this. But part of the fun of it is Trudy Pirandello, who I mentioned is like an octogenarian in Fort Freak, which means she's still pretty old in 1988 because it's set about 20 years earlier. So she's already in her 50s or 60s. So there's the cute factor of a sort of Golden Girls demographic lady teaming up with a little 8-year-old kid, and the fact that they're both women, of course, is significant. Particularly, this was during the when Donald Trump's nasty woman meme was big. I think that was a big influence on Kevin Andrew Murphy's tale here. The phrase "nasty woman" does turn up in the book. And Kevin Andrew Murphy, if I haven't talked about it before, I guess maybe I haven't, but he's a great one if you love continuity, because he's got a real head for it, and he loves to put a lot of Easter eggs into his stories. This one is really loaded with Easter eggs. I mean, even the fact that Jessica Van der Staat is in it is kind of like arguably a deep cut. Maybe not a really deep cut because we just read about her in Volume 7, but quasi deep cut. But then there's also I'm trying to think who else. And then there's a lot of appearances by Fort Freak police officers. Like I said before, Fort Freak is Volume 21, and this is Volume 8. But Kevin Andrew Murphy makes retcons not just Pirandello, who first appeared in Volume 21, but a lot of the Fort Freak cops that we meet in 21. This makes it so hard to talk about because I haven't actually done a video about number 21 yet. Maybe I should have done that first. I don't know. But there's several cops, including the main character in that book is named Leo Storyman, who's the whole deal is that it's like his last case before he retires. That kind of classic cop trope, the cop who's about to retire but wants to solve that one last case that he has to solve. Which means, again, if he's retirement age in 2010 when that book takes place, then he was certainly already a cop in 1988. only 20 years earlier. So we get a little Leo Storgman cameo, and some of the other cops who are older in Fort Freak, older in terms of age, we get to see their 20 years younger version in little cameos in Murphy's Tower of Gold and Amber. We also get the character Lady Light, which is funny considering that the other interpolated story is about a character named Lady Black. Potentially confusing, but that's why you got to read these books more than once. But Lady Light is a character who previously her only appearance had been in a real brief cameo in Volume 14, I want to say. Yeah, Volume 14. And the point of that being what? And recently, or what was it? Oh no, it was one of the Wildcards blogs on wildcardsworld.com. Walter John Williams did a blog about how he forgot the character existed, or had forgotten by this point. I kind of get the impression he'd even forgotten that he had put her in that story in Volume 14, because she is in there. I think he acts, if you read that blog, he's like, oh, this is a character I created for Wildcards but never used. But he did use her, but briefly. But Kevin Andrew Murphy, when he was writing this one, said, hey, do you mind if I use your Lady Light character? Just a fun little anecdote where Williams is kind of like, I guess you can, because I forgot that she even existed. So absolutely, you can use her however you want. And then there's Gyro Gearloose, is a jumper, but he's not a jumper yet when he shows up in Kevin Andrew Murphy's story. So that's a character who I actually had to ask another Wildcards friend of mine, Greg, who I want to, Greg, if you're watching, let's do a Zoom and we'll do one of these together. I know we talked about doing a bunch of them together, but I think scheduling wise, that would have been really hard for me. But let's at least schedule one, and let's maybe do it for Volume 9, which is coming up, I realize, but I'm just thinking Greg has some great observations about Volume 9 that really deserve to be committed to permanence, to be part of the official record here. So Greg, sorry for that digression. Everybody else is watching, but Greg, let's do it. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, Greg was the one who I was like, who's Gyro? He's got to be somebody, because he shows up. Kevin Andrew Murphy wouldn't put him in here if he wasn't somebody. And it was Greg who reminded me that he's a jumper who is first name-checked in Volume 11 and then also shows up in Volume 14 in the same story that has Lady Light in it, actually. So yeah, it's a continuity extravaganza, and it's also it has a lot of fun with the whole retconning, where now, retroactively speaking, it's the first appearance of Lady Light, it's the first appearance of Gyro Gearloose, the first appearance of Magpie, technically the first appearance of Jessica Vanderstad, even though she was mentioned in the previous book. So a lot of retroactive first appearances, and the whole thing is just kind of a romp. This whole gag about all these thieves. Basically, Croyd is essentially, I can't remember if he's, because the whole thing takes place in Duncan Tower's tower, which of course in the real world we call it Trump Tower, perhaps. All the similarities are coincidental, of course, but so anyway, I can't remember if Croyd is at the tower to rob it. I think maybe he is. Jessica is not. She just sort of happens to be there, but this idea of all these thieves are there to sort of rob the same person on the same night, and so they end up kind of teaming up or tripping over each other, Lady Light being another thief. So it's just got that kind of manic, farcical energy. It's very much a comedy story, which the original version of Volume 8 did not have any comedy stories in it, so it's a little odd. I guess if for someone like me who remembers the original book being kind of relentlessly dark, it's a little odd to see something so broadly comic. But that's probably why they put it earlier in the book, before the tone has really settled into the darker aesthetic. So yeah, it kind of works, and it's interesting because it's Cody Havero is the star of the first volume. She's a female. Second story is about Trudy Pirandello teaming up with Jessica Vanderstad, so 2 more women. Your third story is Horses by Lou Scheiner, which stars Veronica. Later you get Carrie Vaughn writing Lady Black. So even originally, a lot of well, by wildcard standards, a lot of strong female characters, where previous volumes maybe, if you were lucky, had one strong female in the entire book, maybe two, and now we're getting almost half the book with some female protagonists who are all good, all good to cool to read about in their own way, and also all pretty different from each other. That's one of the things I do like about not just the quantity of female characters in this one compared to previous ones, but the fact that there is a kind of a diversity of it, both in age range and just in sort of where they are kind of socioeconomically and emotionally, or their their attitude politically, I suppose you could say. So it's a nice range of female characters, I think, in my opinion. Again, I'm a male reader, so to the extent that I'm qualified to comment on it, I think it's kind of a nice change up from the earlier books, where the female voices were were in shorter supply, generally speaking. So I think we're going pretty long here, so I think I'll stop there. Next time we open with Horses by Lou Scheiner, about the character Veronica, who has no last name. I'll leave off with one other anecdote that kind of bemuses me when I think about this one. It's actually my friend John and I. This was years later, when the first, at a point in history where the first 15 books were the only 15 books, before the gap, because book 15 came out in 95 and then book 16 came out in 2002. So there's a 7-year hiatus. And somewhere in that hiatus, I and John, we both joined, it wouldn't have been a Facebook group because this would have been like 2000 or 2001, just some online discussion forum, chat forum somewhere, for wildcards. And there weren't many such things, I guess even in general, I suppose, but for wildcards especially, it was kind of an obscure thing at the time. It's because it seemed like it was over. I mean, those 15 books would be all the wildcards there ever would be ever again. But somebody on there, so I mean, there wasn't much to chat about, I suppose, because it wasn't like an ongoing concern. But I guess somewhat charmingly, there was somebody on there who was posting, because they were reading through the books for the first time, which in and of itself, I don't mean to sound condescending, like you haven't discovered these books, you're reading them for the first time now. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's kind of enviable if it's your first time. But there was something about his tone. He sort of was acting as if he was reading them in real time. And I just remember John and I laughing because he's halfway through volume 8, which has all these new characters or characters who had previously been supporting rather than leads. So Cody Havero, new character, Veronica, previously only a supporting character. Lazy Dragon, right, previously only supporting character. Mr. Nobody, previously just a side character. And nothing, no Yeoman, no Fortunato, no Tachyon yet. Not if you're only a few pages into the book. Golden Boy, Modular Man, no Turtle. So a lot of the fan favorites are absent, at least at that point in the book. And so yeah, he was like literally, he was right on the verge of getting to the Vic Milan Captain Tripp story, but he hadn't started it yet, and he's like, I don't like how this book is focusing on all these new characters. I don't like that. He's like, I call for the return of Turtle and Tachyon and Captain Trips. And I remember just John and I both being kind of bemused. Hopefully that doesn't seem condescending, but it was like, what do you mean you call for? Like, the books are already written. Maybe he was meant it ironically, but but also it was funny that he was saying, "I call for the return of Captain Trips and Tachyon," because it was like, well, dude, just keep reading because those two characters are in this one. So at least wait till the end of the book before you complain. But it is also kind of an interesting element of wildcards because that is it kind of has become a staple in a way of the books that when they start a new arc, they do kind of introduce a bunch of new characters. Oftentimes, as the arc continues, familiar characters will start to feed back in. You could argue that that's always kind of an element of the wildcards book cycles. Maybe you could argue that you could argue that even with the when they started a second arc, they started it with that wildcards tour of the world, and a lot of the lead characters were not familiar. Some of them were, but a lot of it was literally a character who was native to the country they were visiting. So of course they would be a character that you hadn't seen before, and there would only be a couple, and usually it was towards the back. But Fortunato was there, Tachyon was there. But apart from Golden Boy, but apart from that, it was a lot of new characters. But then if you kept on reading that cycle, familiar characters like Modular Man and Croyd came back in Volume 5 and the Turtle. And then in Volume 6 you had Demise coming back, and in Volume 7 you had Yeoman, and in 5 you had Yeoman too. So I guess they always kind of do that in a way. They sort of start a new cycle with some new blood. I feel like they do that with I guess the Tor relaunch. They just introduced new characters, and these are your new POV characters. But then like the Tor relaunch characters who are so significant in 18, 19, 20, which is the first triad of the Tor relaunch, they're almost all gone when you get to Volume 21. All those characters that you just spent 3 books reading about, very few of them are at all a presence in Fort Freak. Because 18, 19, 20 are the committee triad, so it's a bunch of aces comprising the UN's sort of team of superpowered aces called the committee. And then Fort Freak is all about this police precinct in Jokertown, and it's about the cops of Fort Freak. Only one or two committee members to be seen, maybe only one. But then in Volume 2, there's a whole story where members of the committee like Curveball and Earthwitch and Drummer Boy come back, and then in Volume 20, Volume 21 is Fort Freak. Volume 22, then in Volume 22, the second of the Fort Freak triad, you still get all those precinct police officers, but you also get Drummer Boy coming back, and Earthwitch and Curveball, and then in Rust Belt, and then in the third book, it's almost like a half and half, where half of your point of view characters are Fort Freak characters, and then the other half are members of the committee. So really all through the series, that's sort of a hallmark of how they're structured, where a new cycle will open with more, again, either unfamiliar characters or characters that you're only familiar with as very, very slight side characters now being forefronted. But then as you continue the cycle, they sort of reward your patience by cycling in more fan favorites. And then, of course, by the time you get to the end of that cycle, some of those obscure characters that you weren't interested in, or maybe were less interested in at first, have now become established, and now they're the ones that you're going to look forward to them coming back. I think of like characters like another example is John Joseph Miller writing number 17, where he introduces several like brand new characters. And I remember reading that one and thinking, why is he devoting so much time to these new faces? Because that was like after the long hiatus. So for me, I was like, I really miss some of those old fan favorite Wildcards characters. And then if you read that volume, it's like there's several cameos and featured several favorite characters do show up in volume 17. both either in cameo roles or in lead roles. But then there's a huge amounts of the page count are given over to a character named Nighthawk, who's new as of that book, and the Midnight Angel, who's also new as of that book. I remember thinking, well, who are these guys? I call for the return of Captain Trips. Well, but you eventually get to a point where, like, because then, like, the Midnight Angel isn't around in number 18, but then she shows up in 19, and you're like, oh, hey, Midnight Angel again. I remember her, and then I think it's in the middle of the Fort Freak triad too, which is like volume 22. So now it's been like several books since we first met the Midnight Angel, and now every time she shows up, because I think she's a side sort of a supporting character in number 22, and then is a lead character again for number 23. And when you kind of get to book 23, you start going, oh, cool, the Midnight Angel's back. Even though at the time it was like, who's this Midnight Angel person? And the same with Nighthawk, that character, who just shows up in number 17 and then seems like maybe you're never going to see him again. So at the time you're like, well, what was the point of that guy? I don't know. And then I think it would be Low Chicago, which is book 25, where Nighthawk suddenly shows up and he's a lead character again, and now it's been like, however many, now suddenly it's like an old friend, like, oh my god, John Nighthawk's back, that's so cool. So the Wildcard series, it does have that effect on you, that there's kind of an interesting psychological effect with this saga that's so loaded with characters. You sort of find yourself always kind of attracted to familiar characters when they show up. Obviously, there are characters who kind of hit the ground running, and you love them as soon as they show up. But there is a psychological effect of loving the familiar. So sometimes the first appearance of a new character, and maybe I'm speaking only for myself. Maybe other Wildcards fans have a different experience. I've always had this experience though of kind of having a little bit of that guy online who called for the return. Like sometimes when reading about new characters, being like, I call for the return of my favorites, and then eventually getting to a point where these new characters that I wasn't interested in at first are now the ones that I'm happy to see when they come back for a repeat, or when they come back for a second appearance or a third. Sorry for the long digression, I guess, but I just thought that was just something that I always remember that guy online complaining about when he was only a third of the way through this book, but realizing that in a way he had hit upon a kind of characteristic element of the series and the way they divvy these up, and the sort of there is a certain pattern and a cycle to the way new characters are introduced, and old characters are held in check for a bit and then brought back again, sort of giving you that sense of that sort of applause factor of like, keeping the turtle out for a few books so that when the turtle comes back, you're like, yes, I've been waiting for him. And then a few books later, the characters who seemed like the ones who were usurping the turtle's screen time, like Veronica or whoever, the Oddity or Mr. Nobody. After a few books of being familiar, they're the ones where every time Mr. Nobody comes back, you're like, all right, Mr. Nobody's back. So, kind of a neat feature of the series. There are probably other examples. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's I can't think of really another series, even something like the X-Men, which tended to cycle a lot of characters in and out, like the Claremont X-Men. I don't know that there was ever the same sense of them being. I don't feel like the character roster changed quite as fluidly as with something like Wildcards, where every book has some returning characters and some brand new ones, and just the way it would be interesting to kind of graph it out, and kind of maybe I'll do that just for fun and flash it up, just kind of graph it out like, this character appeared in book 1 and then book 5 and then 7 and then 8, and just sort of versus this character who first appeared in book 5 and then was back for 6 but then didn't come back again until 10. That kind of stuff is always really fascinating to me It's one of the elements of the series that I really like. Is just the way everything kind of interweaves with some stuff. If you think of it as different musical tracks, like every so often they turn one track down so that you don't hear it for a while. You go 3 or 4 books without that track, and then they crank it back up, and then it's now a familiar element that you're like, oh, all right, there's that bass line that I've missed for so long. Maybe that's actually a totally different topic that I should have saved, but it seemed relevant to Volume 8. So, like I said, next time we'll look at horses. But until then, good night.
Doesn't have any class. She says, "Hon, what is it?" "I'm trying to visit with my pal Melinda Snodgrass. Shoot the breeze with Walter John Williams. Hang out with Howard Waldrop. I've been smarting for George R.R. Martin. His characters have so much pop. I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. My heart's broken several places. Baby's just sitting there reading about aces."